The night they decided I was not one of them started in a trendy little bistro in Miami's Wynwood district. I told myself this celebration, for my adoptive sister Courtney's new promotion, was important. I wore a simple suit, carrying a small, expensive gift I probably should not have bought, but family was supposed to be worth it. The moment I reached their table, Courtney pushed her chair back, the scrape against the concrete floor drawing attention. Her voice carried just enough to ensure the nearby diners heard every word. At the restaurant. My sister announced to everyone, "Get out of here, go find another table. This one is for family, not adopted boys." They all laughed and agreed. Then, the waiter placed a $2,000 bill in front of me for their entire dinner. I smiled, took a sip, and paid the bill. But after that, I heard a voice scream, "Just a moment, please, X." The laughter from my parents, Deborah and Franklin, and my brother, Ethan, was easy. It was not nervous or accidental. It was the sound of a private joke confirmed in public, and it scalded my neck. I had lived under their roof for over 20 years. They had given me their last name, their address, and every single one of their rules. Yet, they had just reminded me exactly where I belonged, and that was nowhere near their celebration. I did not turn and leave. I could have. The humiliation was a living thing, tightening my chest, but I fought the impulse to flee. Instead, I slid quietly into the empty chair at the very end of the table. I made myself small, watching them. They ordered the most expensive things on the menu: 4 different appetizers, a round of craft cocktails, oversized entrees they only picked at, and finally, 3 different desserts. The sound of their conversation, loud, self-congratulatory, and completely excluding me, was a constant, grating noise. I tracked every item in my head, mentally converting the prices into the hours I spent freelancing, the savings I had meticulously built up, and what my next rent check would feel like. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a performance of their excess designed for my consumption. The waiter, clearly a veteran of expensive, casual dining, finally approached. He placed the heavy leather folder containing the check directly in front of me, an unspoken acknowledgement that the party was over and the cleanup was mine. The total was exactly what I had feared: $2,000. Written out in bold script. No one reached for it. My mother, Deborah, glanced at the check and then back at her half-eaten dessert, dismissing the amount as negligible. "You've got that new digital client now, Caleb." My father, Franklin, said, his voice flat with expectation. "You can handle it. Think of it as your contribution to the family celebration." The phrase, "your contribution," hung in the air, tasting of ash. It was never a shared expense, never an acknowledgement of my own hard work. It was only a toll for my presence. I looked at the number, then at their faces, smiling, entitled, waiting for me to perform gratitude. I did not move for a long moment. Then, a slow, cold smile stretched across my face, a mask of total control. I picked up the folder, slid my card inside, and signed the receipt with a flourish. As I took one final, slow sip of my water, I knew I was not just paying a bill. I was paying the final fee to walk out of that restaurant and out of their lives, for good. The $2,000 was the cost of my freedom. I stood up, pushing my chair in neatly, and prepared to leave. The humid Miami night felt heavy outside the doors, but I felt oddly weightless, ready to embrace the void. The humid air of the Miami night was a physical weight, pressing against me the moment I stepped out of the bistro. I walked quickly. The memory of the $2,000 bill and my sister's laughter still burning, yet strangely, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had paid my dues. I was free. I had not taken more than a dozen steps when the steady, controlled tap of heels approached from behind. The sound was deliberate, not rushed. Nothing like the scattered, chaotic energy of my family. I stopped, turning to find Aunt Margaret standing beside me. Margaret was my mother's older sister, a figure who had always existed on the periphery of our family gatherings. Always impeccably dressed, polite, and distant. Never unkind, but never involved in my life either. She did not reach out to comfort me or offer a weak apology. She simply stood there, allowing the noise of the restaurant and the sting of the evening to recede into the background. Her presence was calm in a way that demanded attention, her posture straight as though she were bracing against a gale I could not feel. "Caleb," she said, her voice low and measured, devoid of any expected sympathy or drama. "Come with me." I didn't question her. The hollow, exposed feeling spreading through my chest was overwhelming, and the structure of following her firm direction felt safer than confronting the reality of going back to the house that no longer felt like a home. I followed her to her immaculate sedan, parked a few blocks away. The drive was short, silent, and entirely unsentimental. There were no offers of comfort, no questions about my feelings, and no attempts to soften the events of the evening. We drove through the city lights, which eventually gave way to the towering luxury condos overlooking Biscayne Bay. Margaret lived in one of them. Her apartment was minimalist and precise, filled with clean lines and art that reflected her measured taste. The view, a sweeping vista of lights spilling across the water, barely registered with me. My focus was only on the hollow, aching space where my loyalty to my family had once been. She motioned toward a sleek, modern dining table, and I sat. The simple, physical act of obeying a direction was oddly grounding. Margaret set her designer bag down with quiet care, her movements slow, not from fatigue, but from deliberate control. She joined me across the table, her expression unreadable but unwavering. "I was at the bar," she said, her voice the same tone she might use to comment on the temperature. "I saw everything. I heard everything." That quiet statement, delivered without a hint of dramatization, carried more weight than any shouting I had endured inside the restaurant. It was a cold, hard piece of truth that I couldn't argue with, delivered by someone who had no emotional stake in lying. She leaned forward slightly. The quietness of her voice deepened, adding a sharp, focused clarity to her words. "I will not watch you return to a place where you are treated as a disposable accessory, Caleb. Your mother and father have lost the right to speak to you about family with authority." I stood aside long enough. She did not soften her words, nor did she offer warmth. There was only the sharp, clean edge of certainty that left no room for doubt. It was the complete opposite of the gaslighting, the emotional manipulation, and the forced sentimentality I had grown up with. It was simply a clear, undeniable position. She advised me to stay with her for a while, at least until the acute sting of the humiliation and the financial shock had receded, allowing me to think, without the constant cloud of guilt and obligation. I agreed immediately. I did not understand her motives, or why she had chosen to intervene, now after all these years of distance. But the alternative, returning to the house and their expectations, was unbearable. Later that night, as I lay in the pristine guest room, staring at a ceiling that held no memories, I realized something profound. For the first time, I was occupying a quiet space without the constant need to prove my usefulness or minimize my presence. I was not a guest in my own life here. I was simply present. Margaret's certainty lingered in the air, steady and unshaken, promising a stability I had never known. I didn't know what she planned, but I had the distinct, quiet sense that nothing about my future would unfold the way my past had, and that feeling alone was the first fragile bloom of hope I had felt in years. Morning arrived. With a muted stillness in Margaret's condo, a contrast to the churn of disbelief and fragile hope inside me. I found Margaret already seated at the dining table, her posture straight and formal, a thick legal folder resting in front of her. She looked as though she had been waiting for this exact moment to begin. A man stood beside her, introduced with only a brief, professional nod as attorney Howard Lane. His presence was immediately clinical and precise, signaling that this meeting was far from casual. I took the seat across the table from him, bracing myself instinctively, though I had no idea what unknown weight I was preparing to absorb. Howard opened the folder, his movement practiced, and slid several documents across the polished table. Each piece of paper was marked with complex numbers, archaic signatures, and dates that felt impossibly old. The gravity of the ink was immediate. Howard began outlining a financial history that, until this moment, I hadn't known belonged to me. He spoke of a financial trust, established by my birth parents long ago. It was intended to be substantial, securing my education, health care, and stability through adulthood. The original figures, which Howard recited with emotionless clarity, were staggering. They were amounts far beyond anything I had ever dreamed of possessing while scraping together money from part-time jobs and navigating scholarships. Then the narrative shifted, the documents changing to reflect years of transactions. According to the records, the trust had been accessed repeatedly by my adoptive mother, Deborah, and my father, Franklin. The withdrawals were systematic, labeled broadly as family expenses, and consistently routed into accounts I had never heard of, accounts separate from my own limited funds. My pulse tightened, a hollow thump beneath my ribs, as Howard continued. The details struck with a painful, sharp clarity. I had grown up counting change, using worn, second-hand textbooks, and patching old sneakers, convincing myself that the limits placed on me were normal, that I should be perpetually grateful for the roof over my head. I had spent my life attempting to make myself small, to be an unnoticeable convenience. Meanwhile, my sister, Courtney, and my brother, Ethan, had thrived without apparent financial restrictions. They enjoyed expensive private tutoring, went on out-of-state trips framed as necessities, and pursued hobbies that demanded premium equipment. I had never understood the massive imbalance. Now, the explanation sat inches from my hands, laid bare in the packet of legal statements. The trust had been drained, slowly and completely, for every purpose, except the one it was meant for me. Howard reported the numbers without a shred of emotion. He didn't need to. The figures carried their own ruthless, clinical tone, stripped entirely of interpretation. Margaret watched me steadily from the side, her expression unreadable but unwavering. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to comfort me, or soften the blow. She simply allowed the information to land where it needed to. When Howard finished, he closed the folder with a controlled motion, sealing the weight of the revelation and leaving it firmly in my possession. I wasn't sure what reaction I expected from myself. Rage, disbelief, or the sudden onset of grief. Instead, there was an unexpected, powerful clarity. Pieces of my childhood, long scattered and confusing, began to fall into place with a cruel, precise fit. The lectures about budgeting, the thrift store holidays. The crushing guilt assigned to every small request I made. None of it aligned with the picture painted by the trust's original value. The foundation of my life had been built on a constructed, deliberate lie. Before I could organize the storm of realization pushing against my ribs, Howard began outlining the next steps, the legal options available to me. Each path was rooted in documentation and procedure, not in the emotional devastation I felt. Margaret didn't elaborate, only signaling with a quiet nod that she supported whatever path I chose. In that overwhelming moment, I sensed that the life I thought I had understood, a life of scarcity and obligation, had been built entirely on a foundation I was never meant to see, a foundation of calculated, cold-hearted betrayal. The quiet anger began to solidify, no longer an abstract hurt, but a focus on the documented facts laid out on the table. The days immediately following the trust revelation settled into a strained rhythm. My life felt emptied out, and then refilled with the cold, hard shadows cast by the people I had believed were my family. Margaret handled the detailed conversations with Howard, the lawyer, while I remained mostly within the quiet shelter of her condo. I tried to focus on my freelance, client work, clinging to the comforting structure of routine, pretending that it could somehow shield me from the massive, documented betrayal I now carried. But the truth kept pressing, an undeniable weight at the edge of every quiet moment. The drained trust, the false scarcity of my childhood, the 20 years of calculated lies. Then, the outside world began to intrude. It started with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I let them go to voicemail, assuming the usual spam or wrong numbers. By midday, the pattern changed. One message mentioned statements made by your family. Another, more specific, asked for clarification regarding an online post. I checked my phone, and the notification stack was growing fast. Someone had stirred a pot, and whatever was inside was now spilling over rapidly. Howard arrived that evening to meet with Margaret, and his tone was noticeably sharper than before. He explained the situation immediately. My adoptive parents, Deborah and Franklin, were attempting to frame the situation publicly. They hadn't named me directly, but the implications were unmistakable. They were painting a picture of themselves as exhausted, loving caretakers who had supported a difficult, ungrateful boy for decades, slept, and who were now being taken advantage of by outside influences, meaning Margaret. The narrative they put forth was crystal clear. I was opportunistic, undeserving, and now trying to exploit their generosity. My stomach tightened, a knot of familiar fear and disgust. Howard, strictly factual, outlined how quickly these claims could escalate. Without documentation and a counter-narrative, public perception could solidify into permanent opinion long before the documented truth had a chance to breathe. He wasn't dramatic or emotional. He simply delivered the facts, which I was learning could be ruthless without ever having to raise their voice. Later that night, another message came through, this time from a local reporter known for investigative pieces on family disputes and estate conflicts. She stated she had received documents and statements from parties related to my upbringing and wanted to offer me the opportunity to contribute to the full picture. Her wording was cold professional curiosity, confirming that my adoptive family had escalated this tension far beyond the private sphere. I stared at the message, unsure. Responding felt like pouring gasoline on a fire I desperately wanted to avoid. I had been conditioned my whole life to avoid conflict at all costs. Margaret walked in, noticing the screen. She didn't ask questions or demand an explanation. She simply delivered a single, unarguable truth. Silence will not protect you now, Caleb. Avoiding the conversation will only allow others to define you before you ever get the chance to define yourself. Her certainty was unsettling precisely because it was so true. My voice had always been the quietest in any room, trained to avoid creating inconvenience. But conflict had arrived without my consent, and avoidance was no longer a path. Howard suggested a controlled approach, a formal interview with documentation present, allowing us to verify every claim and control the dissemination of the facts. The idea felt overwhelming, foreign, and impossible. Yet, a small, steady part of me aligned with it. I recognized that for the first time, I was being asked to defend my own life, rather than apologize for my existence. Hiding hadn't slowed the momentum my adoptive family had already created. By the end of the night, weighed down by the knowledge that the world was already judging me based on lies, I agreed to the interview. It wasn't out of a desire for vengeance or ambition. It was simply because the documented truth had carried me this far, and silent had offered me absolutely nothing but humiliation. I reluctantly accepted the necessity of stepping into the light. The studio where the interview would be filmed was tucked inside a renovated warehouse, on the outskirts of Wynwood, far from the polished chaos of the bistro. Walking inside felt like stepping into a world built for pure, clinical scrutiny. Bright lights hung suspended overhead, cables snaked across the floor like vines, and quiet figures adjusted cameras and microphones with practiced precision. Nothing about the environment resembled the emotional turmoil of my childhood home, yet the tightening in my chest carried the same old, familiar shape. A man introduced himself as Daniel Morse, the producer, offering a calm explanation of the filming process. His tone was steady, professional, almost soothing in its neutrality. He wasn't there to comfort me. He was there to capture a segment that viewers would watch without ever knowing the crushing weight behind every single detail. That realization, the focus on objective accuracy rather than sympathy, actually did more to steady me than any pep talk could have. Margaret sat nearby, off camera, positioned just close enough that I could sense her presence anchoring the room. She was my structure, and I felt less likely to collapse under the pressure simply because she was there. Howard, the attorney, was also present, standing slightly off to the side. The interviewer positioned herself across from me. She was high profile, someone whose coverage often shaped public opinion rather than simply reporting it. The pressure in the room shifted subtly, becoming heavier. Once the cameras began to roll, the questions started, direct, but controlled, avoiding invasive spectacle. They focused first on my upbringing, the conditions surrounding the adoption, my understanding of my financial situation, and the events leading up to my decision to leave my family and stay with Margaret. The interviewer never asked, "Did you love your family?" She asked, "Were you supported by them?" It was a distinction that landed with unexpected, clarifying force. Support, not sentiment, was the standard here. Howard was off to the side, monitoring each question with quiet vigilance. He didn't intervene, but the awareness of his presence functioned like a sturdy boundary line, reminding me that I was navigating this carefully documented confrontation with professional oversight. As the interview progressed, I felt something shifting inside me. It was a release of years spent swallowing discomfort and minimizing my own truth. The more the interviewer pressed for clarity and facts, the more I realized how much of my life had been shaped by a self-imposed, fearful silence. When the conversation finally circled back to the dinner that triggered everything, I spoke the details. Not with anger, but with the cold, hard memory of betrayal. I described the scene, giving the context of my family's cruelty and entitlement. I recounted the most painful moment, repeating my sister's devastating words. At the restaurant, my sister announced to everyone, "Get out of here. Go find another table. This one is for family, not adopted boys." They all laughed and agreed. Then the waiter placed a $2,000 bill in front of me for their entire dinner. I smiled, took a sip, and paid the bill. But after that, I heard a voice scream, "Just a moment, please!" I explained that the scream had been Margaret, intervening to give me shelter and structure, and to confirm that the truth would finally be pursued. With every sentence, I felt a quiet, steady part of me aligning with the decision to fight. My voice, long conditioned to be quiet, was finally beginning to speak for my own life, rather than justifying my place in someone else's. I recognized that I was embracing a new, terrifying vulnerability, but for the first time, it felt like it was leading towards self-respect. I had just finished explaining the depth of the betrayal, feeling the shaky satisfaction of finally speaking, when the door to the studio opened abruptly. The interruption wasn't a loud bang, but the sudden change in the controlled, professional atmosphere was palpable, drawing every eye in the room instantly. My sister, Courtney, stepped inside. Her expression was tight, her shoulders rigid, radiating a desperate confidence. She had not been invited, she was not part of the production, yet she walked toward the equipment as though she fully expected the cameras to immediately turn and focus on her. She seemed to believe her arrival alone could forcibly recalibrate the entire narrative that was being recorded. The crew froze, uncertain but cautious. Their professionalism was momentarily overridden by the unexpected intrusion. Courtney bypassed the producer and the attorney, marching toward the center of the controlled space. She began speaking loudly, insisting that the story being recorded was incomplete and accusing the production of malicious manipulation. Her voice was sharp, rising with each sentence, the words tumbling out too quickly, driven by a frantic desperation, rather than any calculated strategy. She was losing control, right in front of the lens. "This is all a lie designed by her," Courtney insisted, pointing vaguely in my direction. "He's ungrateful. And he's being guided by that manipulative old woman. You don't understand the sacrifices we made. We gave him a life he never deserved." Then, in her rush to justify her family's actions and control the situation, she shouted the one thing that pierced through the room's careful calm. It was the truth, delivered as a bitter defense. "Slept. The money taken from the trust was a fair return for raising someone who wasn't ours to begin with." Silence followed. It was not the silence of confusion, but the heavy, suffocating silence of shock and realization. No one agreed with her sentiment, but the sheer weight of her statement, the acknowledgement of the monetary transaction, the rejection of any familial bond, absorbed all the air around us. The cameras running on autopilot were still recording. Every syllable of her outburst, every frantic justification, every damning word about the true nature of their guardianship had been captured. It was unfiltered, without rehearsal, and completely unprotected by legal or emotional boundaries. I felt no immediate triumph, and certainly no satisfaction. What settled inside me was a strange, quiet clarity, a deep, steady understanding. The truth had finally spoken, not through my careful testimony or Margaret's measured strategies, but through the chaos and panic of the person who had tried to deny it. My sister's desperation had delivered the final, undeniable piece of evidence. The central conflict was no longer about what I claimed or what they denied. It was about what the camera had captured. I simply watched her, feeling the years of swallowed conflict release its grip. The tension that had been building inside me since the dinner evaporated, leaving behind a profound peace. I had sought justice by speaking my truth, but in the end, the truth had spoken for itself, making the moment of undeniable clarity my ultimate vindication. Courtney's accidental confession was the point of no return. The days between the recording of the interview and the court hearing felt suspended in a strange, anticipatory stillness. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something irreversible to occur. Statements, legal filings, and invitations moved through the justice system with a discipline I had never experienced in any part of my life. With my adoptive family, there was no yelling, no panicked phone calls, and no desperate, guilt-laced explanations. Only documents, specific dates, and procedures advancing with slow, steady inevitability. By the time the hearing arrived, the emotional noise that usually accompanied anything involving my adoptive family had been replaced by a sharper, quieter anticipation. The courthouse in downtown Miami, with its marble floors and high ceilings, carried a gravity that relied on order, not intimidation. The walls did not echo with my personal history. They simply held the process in place. Howard walked beside me, his calmness a steady structure I could rely on. He offered brief, precise instructions on where to sit and how the schedule would unfold. Inside the hearing room, the distance between the tables felt impossibly wide. My adoptive mother, Deborah, and my father, Franklin, sat stiffly across the room, their posture broadcasting a kind of wounded, righteous pride. My sister, Courtney, and my brother, Ethan, avoided my gaze entirely. It was the first time I had seen them since the studio outburst, and the room's formality seemed to have shrunk them somehow. Not in stature, but in their certainty. The judge, while the rest of the house slept, began by reading through the submissions with meticulous attention, leaving no space for emotional interpretation. The original trust documents were reviewed. The withdrawal history, the figures stripped bare of any familial context, was meticulously examined. The intended purpose of the trust was outlined with stark clarity. Nothing about the presentation was sensational. Even the footage from the recorded interview was treated as a piece of evidence, not a spectacle. Courtney's sudden, raw outburst, captured cleanly by the cameras, was played without commentary. Her voice filled the room for a moment. The words stripped of the frantic chaos that had accompanied them in the studio, leaving behind only the crushing weight of the statement. The money taken from the trust was a fair return for raising someone who wasn't ours to begin with. It was undeniable, unaltered, and damning. Howard presented our side with the same measured precision he had shown from the beginning. He didn't try to paint me as a heroic victim, nor did he elevate Margaret into an angel. He simply placed the documented facts in order, one after another, until the 20-year narrative of deception became impossible to frame as a simple misunderstanding. His language was clinical, his tone steady. I realized that the truth, when delivered this way, needed no embellishment to be powerful. When the judge delivered the ruling, the room felt as though it had narrowed, focusing intensely on every word spoken. The decision was firm and unequivocal. The attempt by Deborah and Franklin to contest Margaret's intentions regarding her estate was rejected immediately. More importantly, The trust withdrawals were officially deemed inappropriate, requiring repayment in full, including all accrued amounts calculated over the many years. The ruling didn't assign malice, it assigned accountability. Accountability, in that moment, carried far more consequence than blame ever could. Deborah pressed a hand against her mouth, attempting to steady herself. Franklin stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, the verdict settling over him like a crushing, unexpected weight. Courtney's expression flickered with disbelief, while Ethan seemed to physically shrink into his chair. I didn't feel triumph or vindication. What settled inside me was a quiet, profound realization. Something long overdue had finally been acknowledged by the one person with the authority to name it. When the judge adjourned, the room emptied with a respectful, controlled silence. No one called after me. No one tried to explain or apologize. For the first time, their absence felt like the deliberate, final closing of a door I had spent my life trying, and failing, to step through. I was finally on the outside, and I had chosen it. In the weeks after the ruling, the shape of my life shifted quietly, as though the world had been rearranged, while I wasn't looking. The media noise surrounding the case faded into a distant hum, replaced by a steady, predictable pace that finally allowed room for decisions I had never imagined making. There was no dramatic announcement of change. It settled gradually, carried by the simple knowledge that the foundation under my feet finally belonged entirely to me. Margaret of the house declined with a gentle tenderness that did not ask for pity. She carried herself with the same calm resolve she had shown since the night we left the restaurant, guiding her affairs with a clarity that made every step feel purposeful. I stayed close, not out of obligation, but out of a connection that had grown unexpectedly strong. Her presence had become a quiet type of gravity, subtle, grounding, and unmistakable. When she passed, the moment was quiet and controlled, just like her life. There was no struggle, only a soft exhale that marked the end of a life defined by choices she rarely explained, but always stood by. I handled the arrangements with Howard's support, feeling the weight of responsibility, but not being crushed by it. My grief didn't arrive as a sudden storm. It came as a steady ache, threaded inextricably with profound gratitude that she had chosen to step into my life exactly when she did. The estate transferred without complication or dispute. The legal clarity Margaret had demanded left no room for contest. I used a significant portion of the inheritance to establish a small foundation, aimed at supporting children aging out of foster care. The foundation provides tutoring, financial guidance, and practical resources. The stability I once desperately wished I had but never received. Slept. Building it gave direction to the years that felt lost, transforming them into something with purpose, rather than regret. News of my adoptive family surfaced occasionally. My mother, Deborah, lost her administrative job after the financial judgment became public record. My father, Franklin, returned to manual shift work, unable to secure anything more stable due to the notoriety of the case. My sister, Courtney, struggled to find meaningful employment. Every interview seemed to end once her involvement in the public case came up. My brother, Ethan, filed for bankruptcy within months. Their lives contracted under the weight of the consequences, each outcome tied directly to the selfish decisions they had insisted were harmless. None of them reached out with apologies or genuine remorse. When messages did appear, they came in the form of indirect, entitled requests, questions about temporary financial help, or vague opportunities to start fresh. I blocked each one without hesitation. There was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to forgive. Distance, once something imposed on me, had now become a necessary boundary. I finally had the right to choose. My own days filled with work, foundation meetings, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing real, tangible change take shape. I was not searching for reconciliation or vengeance. I was searching for stability. Slept. And for the first time, I felt it forming around me, in a way that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. The past no longer dictated the structure of my decisions, it simply informed them. And, somewhere within that steady rhythm, I finally understood that walking away, that night, had never been about proving anything to them. It was only ever about reclaiming the space to define a life that had once been designed entirely without my input.